Here we are in front of the Nightingale-Brown House. Whoops. Now, this is across the street from one of the most famous buildings in Providence, the John Brown House. Built in the 1780s, John Brown was one of the celebrated Brown brothers, along with his brothers. Well, first of all, James, kind of the forgotten brother, died at a very young age. Also, his sister, Mary Vanderlight, has sometimes been overlooked. People don't always realize the Brown brothers had a sister, but the four famous brothers in order of birth are Nicholas, Joseph, John, and Moses. John was a patriot involved in the burning of the Gaspee. He was involved in many trades, not personally as a sailor, but as a funder of ships to China. And the dark side of his legacy, which in some ways has become the thing for which he is probably best known, is that his ships were involved in the slave trade. His brother Moses took although actually had been involved with the Sally, the very first ship that his brother funded, but later became the leader of the abolitionist movement in Rhode Island. Here across the street, maybe we should go to the front for a better view. So this is the Nightingale-Brown House. It was built in the early 1790s, a few years after the John Brown House. It was built for a man named Captain Joseph Nightingale, so he was also a merchant. From the title of captain, you can see he was personally a sailor. But by the early 19th century, it had been bought by John Brown's nephew, Nicholas Brown Jr. In fact, this whole block on Power Street was dominated by the Brown family. We can't quite see it through the trees, but next to the John Brown house is the Thomas Point and Ives house, who, if I recall correctly, was Nicholas Brown's son-in-law, married his daughter Hope. And so this was a Brown family dominated block. And this is actually the building that stayed in Brown family hands for the longest. The John Brown House, for most of the later 19th century, was owned by Elizabeth and William and Elizabeth Gamble. Then it was owned by a wealthy early 20th century industrialist, Marsden Perry. And then since 1938, if I recall correctly, it has been the property of the Rhode Island Historical Society. First as their main headquarters that is now located on Aldrich Street. This is kind of their co-headquarters. They do have offices on the upper floors, but it is mostly a historic house museum open to the public. This building stayed in the hands of Nicholas Brown's descendants all the way to the 1980s, at which time, I should mention that Nicholas Brown Jr. was the man who donated $5,000 to what was then called Rhode Island College, not to be confused with the modern day college of that name. And after his donation, it was renamed Brown University. So while John and Moses were involved, while the name kind of honored the entire family, Nicholas Brown Jr. is the direct namesake. And in the 1980s, his descendants donated the house to Brown University. Unfortunately, by this time, it was not in very good shape. It might be kind of like the story of the Three Little Pigs. No surprise that John Brown was practical pig. He built his house out of brick, but this house was made out of wood. The termites had gotten into it. And furthermore, the last person to live here, Anne Kinsolving Brown, was a world-renowned authority on military uniforms, of all things. It was said that her books on this subject, the stacks had become so high they had damaged the floorboards. And so when this house became Brown property, Brown University property, it was not in very good shape. But they had one nice thing, and that was Nicholas Brown's desk/bookcase. And so that ended up being sold at Christie's in New York City, put up to auction, And again, if I had people here, I would give them an opportunity to guess how much it might have gone for. The answer, as you may well know, is $12.1 million. Still to this day, the most expensive piece of furniture ever sold in the United States. Doris Duke, the famous heiress of Newport, she owned the Whitehorn Furniture Museum, which was a major collector of early American furniture. She very badly wanted it, but by this point in her life, she was no longer going to auctions in person. The man she sent, she told not to go above 11 million. If she had been there in person, she might have gone for it, but her ambassador, if you will, her representative, honored her order, and so someone else bought it from, I've heard a private collector from Texas bought it for 12.1 million. And so he spirited it away to his home, but inside there is to this day a nice replica. And I should mention the original architect of this house was a man named Caleb Ormsby. And the grounds that were laid out in the 19th century were designed by Olmsted and Olmsted, connected with Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous designer of Central Park in New York City. I won't do a full stand-up since this video is quite long, but I should mention that when I used to do the Benefit Street tour, we would go out this, and we would use this house as an opportunity to talk about the Providence Preservation Society and their history of preserving the street. We would show some of those 1960 plans that would have been pretty terrible if they had been implemented. And we would mention, you know, Antoinette Downing, Happy Chase, how they bought up buildings and how those buildings now display the PPS plaque. So that would be something we would incorporate into our tours. And of course, we would also talk about urban renewal, how the parts that were not saved, that did end up being destroyed, were the minority neighborhoods. You know, there was a thriving neighborhood where we now have McDonald's and Whole Foods and so forth. And all of that was torn down. And that is a sad thing. But certainly at this end of the street, through the efforts of the PPS, the historic buildings were saved. And so again, when I used to do the Benefit Street tour, we'd go out this gate and I'd do a bit of a stand-up there about the history of the PPS. And this particular house, I might mention, the Daniel Smith house, was originally moved all the way from Chalkstone Avenue. Probably, although I never knew for sure, this probably was connected with the creation of Route 95, because I know part of Chalkstone Ave was demolished for that. But there was an empty lot here. The previous building had burned down, if I recall correctly, and so it was taken all this way and deposited here. And again, it now has the PPS plaque. All right. And my third recording, I think this is sufficient, I hope, to try to get across my communication skills. You know, unfortunately, at this time of year, all my tour guide groups are currently taking the winter off, so I couldn't record anything. And of course, I would have needed to get consent and everything, so maybe it's just as well. So I couldn't record any actual tours, but I have recorded these reenactments for you. And again, I hope that will impress you, if that's not too strong a word, with my communication skills. So thank you very much for watching these, and thank you for considering me, as I hope you will, for this position. And now let's stop.